Blood tastes like old pennies and regret. Clara swallowed a mouthful of it, pressing her cheek against the wet asphalt. Rain washed the grime into her fresh cuts, stinging with a bright, sharp heat. Above her, Ricky raised his heavy boot again. She closed her eyes, curling tighter, waiting for the inevitable crack of her ribs. Instead, a heavy silence dropped over the alley. A smooth engine purred, a door slammed, and a voice, entirely devoid of pity, cut through the dark. "Bring her to me." The alley behind Coda always smelled of rotting citrus and stale beer. Tonight, the driving rain brought out the undertone of motor oil and raw sewage. Clara kept her eyes squeezed shut, her forearms locked tightly over her ears. She was trembling, though, whether from the biting November cold or the shock radiating through her body she couldn't tell. Ricky's breathing was heavy, wet, and labored. He was out of shape, a mid-level enforcer who spent more time drinking at the bar than collecting on the streets. But he was heavy, and his steel-toed boots were doing their job. "Stupid bitch!" Ricky panted the words, carrying a sloppy slur. "Think you can hold out on the register? Think I don't count the drops?" Clara didn't answer. There was no point. The $40 she'd skimmed to keep her electricity on was already gone, spent 3 days ago. If she opened her mouth, he would kick her in the teeth. Survival in the gutter meant knowing when to play dead. She tucked her chin to her chest. Another kick caught her in the thigh. Pain exploded outward, a dull, sickening thud that sent a spasm of nausea up her throat. She bit down on her tongue to keep from crying out. Crying only made Ricky angrier. It made him feel like a monster, and Ricky hated feeling like a monster. He preferred to think of himself as a businessman, making a point. "Look at me," he snarled, grabbing a fistful of her damp, matted hair. He yanked her head back. The movement tore a jagged gasp from her lips. The streetlights at the end of the alley were hazy halos of orange against the downpour. Ricky's face was a shadow, but she could smell him, cheap aerosol deodorant and cheap whiskey. Then a sound broke the rhythm of the beating. The heavy steel door of the club's VIP exit groaned open, its rusty hinges squealing against the brick. Ricky froze his grip on her hair, loosening slightly. Clara dropped her gaze, her eyes landing on the deep puddle, expanding near her knees. Her blood was swirling into the dirty water, diluting into a faint pink ribbon. 4 men stepped out into the rain. Clara couldn't see their faces, only their shoes. Expensive polished leather that had no business in an alley like this. They didn't hurry through the downpour. They moved with a slow, deliberate arrogance, completely unbothered by the weather. An umbrella snapped open with a sharp canvas thwack. Ricky dropped Clara's hair completely. She hit the pavement hard, scraping her chin, but she didn't move. She held her breath. "Mr. Russo." Ricky stammered the whiskey-fueled bravado draining out of his voice in an instant. It was replaced by a thin, reedy panic. I didn't know you were using the back." The man under the umbrella didn't respond. He paused. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain on the metal dumpsters. Clara lay paralyzed. She knew the name, Russo. Everyone who worked in the club, legal or otherwise, knew the name. Damian Russo owned the building. He owned the block. He owned the police precinct, 2 streets over. Damien stepped closer. The tip of a black umbrella tilted slightly, revealing a charcoal cashmere coat. Clara kept her eyes fixed on his shoes. They were pristine. "Ricky," Damien said. His voice wasn't booming. It wasn't loud. It was quiet, conversational, and completely terrifying. It sounded like an engine idling just before a drag race. She was skimming Boss. Ricky rushed to explain his boots shifting nervously on the wet asphalt. "Just teaching her the rules. You know how it is. Can't let the rats get bold." Clara braced herself. She expected the mob boss to nod, to step over her, to get into his waiting car and leave. Why would he care? She was a cleaner, a nobody, a minor accounting error in his vast, bloody ledger. Damien didn't look at Ricky. Clara felt the weight of his gaze drop down to where she lay in the puddle. It wasn't a look of compassion. It felt like an appraisal. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a broken piece of machinery, calculating the cost of repair versus the cost of disposal. Her ribs throbbed. Her lip was split wide open, the blood pooling hot and sticky down her chin. She looked pathetic. She knew it. She met his gaze for a fraction of a second, dark, unreadable eyes beneath a sharp brow, before looking away, ashamed and terrified. "You're making a mess," Damien said finally. "I'll clean it up, boss. Swear it. Just finishing up." "No." The single syllable hung in the cold air. Damien turned away the umbrella, shifting to cover his shoulders as he walked toward a sleek black sedan, idling at the mouth of the alley. A guard opened the door for him. Ricky exhaled a shaky breath, clearly thinking he was off the hook. He reached down, grabbing Clara by the collar of her soaked jacket to haul her up. "All right, get up. You're lucky he—" Damien paused at the open car door. He looked back over his shoulder. The rain seemed to slice past him, avoiding him entirely. "Bring her to me." Ricky froze. "Boss." Damien didn't repeat himself. He slid into the dark interior of the car. The door closed with a heavy, muffled thud. The guard who had been holding the umbrella, a man with a thick neck and a flattened nose, stepped forward. He shoved Ricky backward with an open palm. It wasn't a punch, just a push, but Ricky hit the brick wall hard, gasping for air. "Back off," the guard muttered. Before Clara could comprehend what was happening, large, calloused hands grabbed her under the arms. She shrieked, the sound tearing out of her bruised throat as her ribs screamed in protest. She tried to thrash a weak, pathetic flailing of her arms. "Stop moving or I'll drop you," the guard grunted, hauling her to her feet. Her legs wouldn't hold her weight. The world spun in sickening circles of yellow streetlight and black shadows. She was practically dragged across the asphalt, her toes scraping the ground. Panic, sharp and blinding, finally overrode the pain. Ricky was bad. But Russo's men, people dragged into Russo's cars, didn't come back. They ended up in the river. They ended up in landfills. "Please," she choked out the word, bubbling through the blood in her mouth. "Please, I didn't see anything. I won't say anything." The guard ignored her. He pulled open the rear door of an SUV, parked right behind Damien's sedan, and shoved her inside. She tumbled onto the floorboards, a tangled heap of wet clothes, bruised limbs and sheer terror. The door slammed shut, sealing her in. The contrast was violently jarring. A moment ago, Clara was drowning in freezing rain, the air thick with garbage and exhaust. Now the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled. Warm, dry air blasted from invisible vents, carrying the scent of expensive pine and newly treated leather. It was too quiet. The thick doors and tinted glass muted the storm outside to a distant, gentle hum. She remained curled on the floorboards, too afraid to move. The carpet beneath her cheek was softer than the mattress in her apartment. She was dripping dirty rainwater blood and alleyway grime all over it. The SUV shifted into gear, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. "Get off the floor," the voice came from the seat above her. Not the guard who had thrown her in. It was a different man, older with silver hair at his temples. He was watching her in the rear-view mirror from the front passenger seat. Clara swallowed hard, tasting copper. Slowly, agonizingly, she pushed herself up. Every muscle in her back seized, protesting the movement. She dragged herself onto the back seat, her wet clothes squelching against the pristine, cream-colored leather. She felt a sharp pang of absurd guilt. She was ruining a car that cost more than her life was worth. She huddled into the corner, pressing herself against the door, wishing she could phase through the glass. She hugged her knees to her chest, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together. "Don't bleed on the seats if you can help it," the older man said, entirely matter of fact. He didn't sound angry, just weary. He tossed a folded white handkerchief over the center console. It landed on the seat next to her. Clara stared at it. It was thick cotton, blindingly white. Her hands were shaking too much to grab it cleanly. She fumbled, picking it up and pressing it awkwardly to her split lip. The fabric soaked up the blood, instantly turning a bright, angry red. Outside, the neon lights of the city blurred past. They were moving fast, leaving the club district behind. Where were they taking her? The docks, a warehouse. She looked at the back of the driver's head. Thick neck, closely shaved hair. The older man in the passenger seat was typing on a glowing smartphone, completely ignoring her. She was a package. Freight. "Where?" Her voice was a cracked whisper. She cleared her throat, coughing, as a spike of pain shot through her chest. "Where are we going?" The older man didn't look back. "Mr. Russo's estate." The words dropped into her stomach like lead weights. The estate. That wasn't a dumping ground. That was worse. If they were taking her to his home, he wanted something from her. But what she had, nothing. She was 24, drowning in medical debt from her late mother and working off the books, sweeping up vomit in a mafia-fronted nightclub. She owned 3 pairs of jeans and a dying houseplant. "I don't have any money," Clara blurted out, the panic rising in her chest again. "The $40. I took it, I admit it. But I can work it off. I can work double shifts. I'll scrub the floors with a toothbrush. Please." The older man sighed, finally turning around to look at her. His eyes were pale blue and remarkably cold. "Quiet," he said softly. It wasn't a threat, but it carried the weight of one. Clara clamped her mouth shut, pressing the bloody handkerchief harder against her lips. She forced herself to take shallow, even breaths. In, out. "Don't hyperventilate. Don't give them a reason to drug you or hit you." The ride stretched on. The city lights began to thin, replaced by the dark shapes of tall trees and wrought iron fences. The contradiction of her situation gnawed at her mind. She was terrified, convinced she was going to die tonight. Yet the heated seat was soothing her aching back. The warm air was drying her soaked clothes. It was the most physically comfortable she had been in months, and it felt like a sick joke. The SUV slowed, turning sharply. Clara peeked out the window. High iron gates swung open automatically, revealing a long, winding driveway, lined with manicured hedges. At the end of the drive sat a massive structure. It wasn't an old-world mansion with columns and statues. It was a modern fortress. Concrete steel and massive panes of dark glass built into the side of a hill. It looked cold, impenetrable, and completely unforgiving. The car glided to a halt under a wide portico. "Out," the driver said, putting the car in park. Clara didn't wait to be dragged. She fumbled with the door handle, her slippery, shaking fingers struggling with the latch. It clicked, and she pushed the heavy door open, stumbling out onto the smooth, wet concrete. The cold air hit her again, making her gasp. The older man was already out of the car. He gestured toward a heavy steel side door. "Inside. Follow the hall. First door on the left." She nodded numbly. She had no shoes on, she realized with a dull shock that she must have lost her sneakers in the alley. Her soaked socks slapped softly against the concrete as she walked toward the door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside, crossing the threshold into Damien Russo's world. The room wasn't a dungeon. It was a medical clinic. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. casting a stark, shadowless glare over everything. The walls were painted a sterile, calming blue. Stainless steel cabinets lined the perimeter, locking in neat rows of gauze vials and surgical instruments. In the center of the room sat a black leather examination chair, the paper crinkling slightly, as Clara hesitated in the doorway. The smell of rubbing alcohol and iodine was overpowering instantly, transporting her back to the months she had spent sleeping in the chair next to her mother's hospital bed. Her stomach rolled. "Sit," a voice ordered. A man stepped out from behind a partition. He wore a rumpled dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with veins. A stethoscope hung loosely around his neck. He didn't look like a mob doctor from the movies. He looked exhausted with dark bags under his eyes and a graying beard that desperately needed a trim. Clara moved toward the chair like a sleepwalker. She perched on the very edge, her wet clothes dampening the crisp paper covering the seat. "I'm Dr. Hayes," the man muttered, snapping on a pair of blue latex gloves. He approached her, his eyes scanning her face with clinical detachment. "Lean back." She didn't move. "Why am I here?" Hayes paused. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time. He saw the shivering, the terror in her wide brown eyes, the way her arms were wrapped defensively around her ribs. His expression softened slightly, though his posture remained rigid. "Because the boss brought you here," Hayes said gently, "and my job is to make sure you don't bleed out on his imported rugs. Now lean back." Reluctantly, Clara leaned against the leather. The movement sent a fresh spike of agony through her chest. She winced, a sharp hiss escaping her teeth. "Ribs?" Hayes asked, his hands moving toward her jacket. "Yes," she whispered. "Take the coat off." It was a slow, painful process. Her cheap, waterlogged jacket peeled off her shoulders like a second skin. Underneath, she wore a simple grey t-shirt, now stained brown with old water and fresh blood. Hayes didn't hesitate. He took a pair of trauma shears from a tray and efficiently cut the t-shirt up the middle. Clara flinched instinctively, crossing her arms over her bra, but Hayes just pushed her hands away with gentle firmness. "I'm a doctor, sweetheart. Not a priest, not a threat. Just let me work." The left side of her ribcage was a canvas of deep, angry purples and swollen reds. Hayes probed the area with his gloved fingers. His touch was clinical, applying just enough pressure to assess the damage. Clara bit her lip hard to keep from crying out, fresh tears pricking her eyes. "Two bruised, possibly one fractured," Hayes mumbled to himself, stepping back. "Nothing punctured. You're lucky he was wearing dull boots." He turned to a sink, washing his gloved hands. "I'm going to clean the cuts on your face. It's going to sting." It did sting. The alcohol pad bit into the split on her lip, and the scrape on her cheek like liquid fire. Clara gripped the armrests of the chair, her knuckles turning white. She focused on the buzzing of the fluorescent lights. She focused on the smell of the iodine. Anything to stay grounded. Anything to stop her mind from spiraling into the terrifying question of what comes next. The heavy door behind her opened. The sound was quiet, but it commanded the room. The air pressure seemed to change, the clinical scent of the room suddenly cut by the faint, sharp smell of cold rain, expensive cologne, and cigarette smoke. Dr. Hayes stopped wiping her face. He stepped back, dropping his hands to his sides. "Mr. Russo." Clara didn't turn her head. She couldn't. Her body froze, paralyzed by a prey instinct, telling her that movement meant death. Footsteps slow and measured crossed the linoleum floor. Damien walked into her line of sight. He had taken off the dark overcoat. He wore a crisp white shirt, the top two buttons undone, and dark slacks. Up close in the harsh lighting, he looked even more intimidating than he had in the dark alley. He wasn't conventionally handsome. His features were too sharp, too carved. A faint, thin scar ran through his left eyebrow, his eyes dark as coffee grounds locked onto her. There was no pity in them, no warmth, just a heavy, calculating intelligence. "Damage?" Damien asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Clara's chest. He didn't look at the doctor. He kept his eyes on Clara. Fractured rib, deep lacerations on the mouth and cheek. Mild concussion, most likely. Hayes rattled off entirely professional. "She needs rest ice and painkillers." Damien stepped closer to the chair. Clara shrank back, pressing herself as deep into the leather as she could go. He reached out. She flinched violently, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting for a blow. Instead, she felt the cool, smooth touch of 2 fingers beneath her chin. He tilted her face up toward the light. The touch was firm, inescapable, but not painful. Clara opened her eyes. He was standing right in front of her. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, the tiny flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Her breath hitched. She was terrified, yes, but there was a strange, terrifying gravity to him. He didn't look at her injuries with disgust, nor with sadistic pleasure. He looked at them like a puzzle he was trying to solve. "What is your name?" Damien asked. "Clara," she breathed out. "Why was Ricky kicking you, Clara?" It wasn't a sympathetic question. It was an interrogation. I owed him." "How much?" $40. She felt ridiculous saying it. $40. A rounding error for the man standing in front of her. But it was the reason her ribs were broken. Damien's thumb brushed the edge of her uninjured cheek. The contrast of his warm, clean skin against her freezing, dirty face made a shudder run through her. $40, Damien repeated. The words tasted flat in his mouth. He was risking the heat of a dead body behind my club for $40. Clara didn't know how to answer that. She stayed perfectly still, terrified that if she moved, his fingers would snap her neck. Damien dropped his hand. He turned to Dr. Hayes. "Wrap her ribs. Give her something for the pain. Have Maria find her some clean clothes." He began to walk toward the door. "Wait!" Clara blurted out before her brain could stop her mouth. Damien paused his hand on the heavy steel handle. He looked back over his shoulder. The look in his eyes was dangerous. A warning. "Don't push your luck." "Why?" Clara swallowed the lump of terror in her throat. "Why did you bring me here if I owe you for the medical supplies I can't pay? I told your man I don't have anything." Damien turned fully around. He leaned against the heavy door, crossing his arms over his chest. For a moment, the silence stretched out thick and heavy. "You misunderstand your situation, Clara," Damien said slowly. "You don't owe me for the bandages. You don't owe me for the car ride." He pushed off the door, taking one step back toward her. "Ricky was my employee. He was using my property to conduct unsanctioned business. He made a mess on my doorstep." Damien's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't like messes. I don't like loose ends. And I certainly don't like my employees thinking they can act like animals without my permission." He looked her up and down, taking in the bloody, half-naked, trembling reality of her. "I didn't save you because I felt sorry for you." Damien said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into something raw and absolute. "I took you because you are evidence of a problem in my house. And until I decide what to do with that problem, you belong to me." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and walked out the heavy door, clicking shut behind him, with the finality of a prison cell closing. Clara sat in the silence, the buzzing of the lights suddenly deafening. She looked at Dr. Hayes, who was quietly pulling a roll of thick white medical tape from a drawer. She had survived the alley, but as the cold reality of Damien's words settled into her bones, Clara realized a terrifying truth. She hadn't been rescued. She had just been claimed. Dr. Hayes finished the wrapping with a sharp tear of medical tape that echoed off the tile. The tight compression around Clara's chest made breathing a shallow, deliberate chore. Every inhale stopped halfway blocked by a wall of dull, throbbing heat. "2 of these," Hayes said, dropping 2 small white oval pills into her trembling palm. He handed her a paper cup of tepid water. "They'll make you sleep. Don't fight it. Your body needs to redirect its energy from panicking to healing." Clara stared at the pills. They were chalky and innocent-looking. She tossed them back the dry edge of the tablets, scraping her raw throat, and chased them with the water. Before Hayes could say another word, the heavy clinic door swung open again. This time it wasn't Damien. It was an older woman with iron-grey hair pulled back into a severe bun. She wore dark slacks and a sensible grey sweater. Her face was a map of deep lines, but her dark eyes were sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. She carried a folded stack of clothes over her arm. "Maria." Hayes nodded, stepping back to wash his hands again. "She's all yours. Concussion protocol. Wake her in 4 hours." Maria didn't acknowledge the doctor. She stepped up to the examination chair and dropped the clothes onto the metal tray. "Can you walk?" Her voice was gravelly, carrying a thick, untraceable European accent. "I think so," Clara whispered. "Don't think. No. If I have to carry you, I will drop you." Maria held out a hand. It wasn't an offer of comfort. It was a pragmatic necessity. Clara took it. Maria's skin was dry and calloused her grip like a vice. Clara slid off the crinkling paper. Her bare feet hit the cold linoleum, and a fresh wave of nausea immediately rolled through her stomach. The room tilted. She swayed, grabbing the edge of the chair. "Put these on," Maria commanded, thrusting the clothes at her. They were men's clothes, a pair of thick charcoal sweatpants and a long-sleeved black Henley. They smelled of harsh, unscented laundry detergent. Clara stripped off her ruined damp jeans with agonizing slowness. Bending over to pull the sweatpants up felt like someone was driving a hot nail into her side. Maria didn't help her, nor did she look away. She just watched her face, a mask of weary impatience, as Clara struggled into the oversized garments. The fabric was impossibly soft against her battered skin, a stark contrast to the rough denim and cheap polyester she was used to. It felt wrong. It felt like a costume. "Follow," Maria said, turning on her heel. Clara trailed behind her, clutching the excess fabric of the sweatpants to keep them from sliding off her hips. They left the clinic stepping out into a wide, dimly lit hallway. The floors here were polished dark wood, so glossy they reflected the low amber lights set into the baseboards. The silence of the house was absolute. It was a heavy, soundproofed quiet that made Clara's ears ring. They walked past several closed, featureless doors. The air smelled of beeswax and something faint and metallic like old pennies. It reminded her of the alley. She shivered. Maria stopped at a door near the end of the hall. She opened it and flicked a switch. "Bathroom is through there. Water is in the pitcher. Sleep." Maria didn't wait for a thank you. She pulled the door shut. The heavy click of the latch echoed in the room. Clara stood frozen in the center of the plush, cream-colored carpet. The room was massive, larger than her entire apartment. A king-sized bed dominated the space piled high with thick, slate-gray pillows and a duvet that looked like a cloud. There was no art on the walls. No personal touches. It looked like a high-end hotel room waiting for a ghost. She walked slowly to the door. She reached out her fingers, trembling, and turned the brass handle. It didn't budge. She twisted it harder. Nothing. The click hadn't just been the latch. It had been a lock. From the outside, a cold spike of adrenaline pierced through the heavy, creeping fog of the painkillers. She pressed her forehead against the cool wood of the door, her breath hitching. She was locked in. Damien Rousseau's words echoed in her skull. "You belong to me." Panic clawed at her throat, but her body simply didn't have the energy to sustain it. The pills were pulling her under, wrapping her brain in thick, heavy cotton. Her knees buckled. She staggered away from the door, practically falling face first onto the massive bed. The mattress swallowed her. The linen smelled like fresh air and ironing starch. It was the most comfortable thing she had ever felt, and it was entirely terrifying. She curled onto her uninjured side, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself as small as possible. Outside, the rain beat silently against the thick, reinforced glass of the single window. Clara closed her eyes, the darkness behind her eyelids spinning. She didn't pray to be rescued. She just prayed she would wake up. Light sliced through the room like a physical blow. Clara gasped, her eyes flying open. Sunlight was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling window, blindingly bright after the dark, rainy night. She tried to sit up, and a horrific tearing pain ripped through her left side. She choked on a scream, falling back against the pillows, gasping for air. The painkillers had completely worn off. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been beaten with a meat tenderizer. Her lip throbbed in time with her heartbeat tight and swollen. She lay there for 10 minutes, just staring at the smooth, white ceiling, bargaining with her own body to move. Finally, she rolled onto her right side and pushed herself up. The oversized Henley slipped off her shoulder. She dragged her feet to the edge of the bed. Her bare toes sank into the carpet. A quiet click broke the silence. Clara flinched, her eyes darting to the door. The handle turned. It was unlocked. She held her breath, waiting for someone to walk in. Nobody did. The door just sat there, slightly ajar, an invitation or a trap. Her bladder was aching, forcing her to move. She limped to the bathroom, an expanse of dark slate tile and glass, and splashed cold water on her face. The woman staring back at her in the mirror looked like a corpse. Her left cheek was a mottled canvas of purple and yellow. A white bandage was taped over her split lip. Her brown eyes were sunken, circled by deep, bruised shadows. She dried her face with a towel thicker than her winter coat. She had to get out of this room. She had to figure out where the exits were. Clara pushed the bedroom door open and stepped into the hallway. The house was different in the daylight. The dark wood floors gleamed. The silence wasn't as heavy. It was broken by the faint, distant hum of a central HVAC system and the subtle clinking of porcelain. She followed the sound, keeping her back pressed to the wall, her bare feet silent. The hallway opened into a massive open-concept living space. Walls of glass looked out over a sprawling manicured lawn that ended at a line of dense, dark trees. The sky was a brittle, cloudless blue. To her right was a kitchen straight out of a magazine. Acres of black marble countertops, stainless steel appliances, and sleek, minimalist cabinetry. Sitting at the large island in the center was Damien. He was wearing a dark grey suit, perfectly tailored, though he hadn't put on the jacket or tie yet. His shirt sleeves were rolled up to his forearms. He held a bone-white coffee cup in one hand and was scrolling through a tablet with the other. Clara froze. She wanted to back away to disappear down the hall, but his eyes flicked up, catching her movement instantly. He didn't startle, he didn't smile. He just set the coffee cup down on its matching saucer. The tiny clink sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Sit. It wasn't a request. Clara's legs moved on autopilot. She hobbled toward the island, her arms crossed protectively over her ribs. She pulled out a tall leather stool and sat on the very edge, keeping as much distance between them as the counter allowed. Up close, the smell of his coffee was rich and bitter, mixed with the faint scent of his cologne cedar and something sharp like ozone. Damien slid a plate across the marble. It held 2 pieces of dry toast and a small bowl of sliced fruit. "Eat," he said, his eyes returning to his tablet. Clara looked at the food. Her stomach was a twisted knot of acid and fear. "I'm not hungry." "I didn't ask if you were hungry. Your body experienced a trauma. It requires fuel. Eat the toast." His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. He was issuing a maintenance order for a piece of equipment. Clara picked up a piece of toast. Her hand was shaking so badly it tapped against the plate. She took a tiny dry bite. It tasted like sawdust. She forced herself to swallow. "Why was my door locked?" she asked. The words tumbled out before her brain could filter them. Damien slowly turned his head to look at her. His dark eyes were bottomless, revealing nothing. "Because a concussed, panicked woman wandering my house in the middle of the night is a liability. You would have tripped the security sensors and my men would have shot you." He said it so casually, as if explaining why he kept the milk in the fridge. Clara swallowed hard. "I want to go home." "You don't have a home," Damien replied smoothly. He swiped a finger across his screen. "You rent a basement apartment in the Narrows. You are 2 months behind on rent. Your landlord initiated eviction proceedings yesterday." The blood drained from Clara's face. "How do you know that?" "I know everything that happens in my city," Damien said. "Especially concerning things that belong to me." "I don't belong to you," she whispered, her voice trembling with a sudden desperate flare of defiance. Damien set the tablet down. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the black marble. The air between them suddenly felt suffocatingly thick. He was too close. She could see the individual lashes framing his dark eyes, the precise line of the scar through his eyebrow. "Let me be very clear with you, Clara," he said softly. "Last night, Ricky fractured your rib for $40. He did that because out there you are nothing. You have no money, no family, no protection. Out there you are prey." He reached out. Clara flinched, pulling back, but he just tapped his index finger against the marble countertop, a slow, rhythmic beat. "In here," he continued, his gaze pinning her in place, "you are under my roof. You wear my clothes. You eat my food. You are breathing my air. Ricky's mistake was treating something of mine with disrespect. He will learn from that mistake today. But do not confuse my claiming you with charity. You are here because I require it. When I no longer require it, you will know." Clara stared at him, terrified by the utter lack of emotion in his face. He wasn't a man driven by rage or sadism. He was driven by absolute, unyielding control. "What do you want from me?" she choked out. Damien picked up his coffee cup. He took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "For now," he said, "I want you to finish your toast." The morning dragged into a strange, agonizing purgatory. Clara wasn't locked in the bedroom again, but she quickly learned she was a prisoner all the same. The house was massive, but silent men in dark suits stood at the end of every major corridor. They didn't look at her, didn't speak to her, but their presence was a physical wall. She was allowed in the kitchen, the living room, and the hallway leading to her bedroom. That was her world. She sat on a massive slate-grey velvet sofa in the living room, staring out the reinforced glass at the tree line. The painkillers Dr. Hayes had left on the counter were wearing off again, leaving her side burning with a hot, pulsing ache. She hugged a throw pillow to her chest, trying to apply counter pressure. Around noon, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It wasn't a sound, not at first. It was a change in the air pressure. The silent men in the hallways straightened up. A low, barely audible crackle of radio static drifted from somewhere near the front entrance. Clara sat up, slightly wincing. She looked toward the foyer. Through the massive glass walls facing the driveway, she saw a black SUV pull up. It wasn't the one she had ridden in last night. This one was older, muddy, and lacking the sleek, polished menace of Damien's personal fleet. Two men stepped out of the front. They walked around to the back and opened the door. They dragged Ricky out by his armpits. Clara stopped breathing. Her hands gripped the velvet pillow so hard her knuckles turned white. Ricky looked awful. His clothes were soaked and caked in mud. His head lolled lazily on his shoulders, his face a bruised, unrecognizable mess. One of his eyes was swollen completely shut. He wasn't resisting. He looked like a sack of wet grain being hauled toward the house. The men dragged him out of Clara's line of sight toward a side entrance of the estate. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She scrambled off the sofa, ignoring the scream of her fractured rib, and backed away from the windows. She pressed herself into the corner of the room, near a heavy stone fireplace, trying to become invisible. 10 minutes passed. The silence returned thicker and heavier than before. Then she heard it. The house was soundproofed against the outside world, but not against itself. From somewhere deep beneath her feet, muffled by layers of concrete and wood, came a sound that made Clara's blood run cold. It was a wet, heavy thud, followed by a sharp, pathetic whimper. Clara slapped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. She sank down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. Another thud. A muffled shout. It wasn't like the movies. There were no dramatic speeches, no cinematic music. It was just the ugly, brutal sound of flesh, hitting flesh, echoing faintly through the floorboards. It sounded like work, methodical, unhurried violence. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the darkness only made her hearing sharper. She remembered Ricky's heavy boot connecting with her side. She remembered the smell of his whiskey sweat. She hated him. She had wished him dead in that alley. But hearing him being dismantled piece by piece in the basement of this pristine, silent house was entirely different. It was the sound of a god dealing with a non-believer. The sound stopped after 10 minutes. The silence that followed was suffocating. Clara stayed curled on the floor, shaking violently. She didn't know how long she sat there. The sun shifted across the room, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished wood floor. Footsteps approached, slow, measured, and completely calm. Clara opened her eyes. Damien was walking into the living room. He had taken off his suit jacket. His white shirt was pristine, the cuffs rolled up perfectly. He looked exactly as he had at breakfast, unbothered, untouched, except for one detail. As he stopped a few feet away looking down at her cowering form, Clara saw it. On the crisp white fabric of his right cuff, just above the wrist bone, was a single tiny red speck. A pinprick of fresh blood. Damien followed her gaze. He looked down at his cuff, noticing the spot for the first time. He didn't look disgusted. He didn't try to hide it. He simply unrolled the sleeve, buttoning it neatly at his wrist, covering the stain. "Get up," he said softly. Clara's legs felt like jelly, but the absolute authority in his voice pulled her to her feet. She kept her back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Your debt is cleared," Damien said. His voice was conversational, the tone of a man discussing the weather. "The $40, the insubordination, the mess in my alley. It has all been balanced." Clara stared at him, her chest heaving. "Is he—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The word tasted like ash. "Ricky is no longer an employee," Damien replied smoothly. He stepped closer, invading her space, until she could smell that sharp ozonic cologne again. It entirely masked any scent of violence. He was a faulty cog in a very expensive machine. I replaced him. He reached out. This time Clara was too frozen by terror to flinch. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm, steady, and completely dry. "Do you understand what happens to faulty cogs, Clara?" he asked, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Yes," she whispered, a tear finally breaking free and tracking down her bruised cheek. Damien's thumb caught the tear before it reached her jaw. He wiped it away with a gentle, terrifying precision. "Good," he murmured, "because you are a part of the machine now, and I demand perfection from my property." Healing was an ugly itching process. Over the next 3 weeks, the deep purple landscape across Clara's ribs faded to a sickly yellow-green. The split on her lip knit together into a thin white line that tugged uncomfortably when she drank water. She didn't leave the estate. She didn't even try. The silent men in the hallways remained their presence, a constant heavy pressure at the base of her skull. Maria brought her real clothes on the 4th day. They weren't ball gowns or lingerie. They were armor, high-waisted wool trousers, heavy silk blouses that buttoned to the collarbone, and cashmere sweaters in muted shades of slate navy and black. They fit perfectly. Damien hadn't asked her size. He just knew it, or had someone figure it out. The lack of privacy terrified her, but the silk felt like liquid, cool against her bruised skin. She wasn't asked to clean. She wasn't asked to cook. She existed in a state of suspended animation, wandering the library or sitting by the reinforced windows, watching the autumn leaves rot into brown sludge on the manicured lawns. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, a guard finally spoke to her. "The boss wants you in the study." Clara's stomach seized. She hadn't spoken to Damien since the day in the kitchen. She had seen him, a dark shape, moving through the hallways, a voice murmuring behind closed mahogany doors. But he had ignored her. The machine was running, and she was simply waiting to be slotted into her purpose. The guard escorted her down a corridor she hadn't been allowed in before. The air here smelled different. Less beeswax, more aged paper leather, and the sharp, distinct tang of gun oil. He opened heavy double doors and gestured for her to enter. Damien's study was a cavern of dark oak and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A massive desk dominated the center of the room, buried under neat stacks of manila folders and leather-bound ledgers. Damien sat behind it, the sleeves of his black dress shirt rolled up, reading a document through a pair of silver wire-rimmed glasses that made him look brutally intelligent. He didn't look up when she walked in. "Sit." Clara sat in the leather armchair opposite him. The leather groaned softly under her weight. She kept her hands folded in her lap, her fingernails biting into her palms. Damien finished reading, signed the bottom of the page with a heavy gold fountain pen, and set it aside. He took off the glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He looked tired. It was the first human flaw she had seen in him. "You stole $40 from the Coda register," Damien said. It wasn't a question. Clara's throat went dry. "Yes. My floor managers balance those registers twice a night. They cross-reference the till with the digital pour spouts on the liquor bottles. If a bartender overpours by a quarter ounce, the system flags it." Damien leaned back, resting his elbows on the armrests. He steepled his fingers, staring at her. "So tell me, Clara, how did a cleaner with no high school diploma bypass a $30,000 point-of-sale security system to skim $40 without tripping a single automated alert?" Clara swallowed hard. He wasn't accusing her. He was genuinely curious. "I didn't hack the system," she said, her voice small in the massive room. I just watched. Explain. The system tracks volume, she muttered, looking down at her hands. But it doesn't track inventory flow in real time until the end of the shift. The manager, Marcus, he takes a smoke break every night at 1:15 a.m. during the rush. The bartenders are moving too fast to ring up every single cash transaction immediately. They leave piles of cash next to the register to sort when the rush dies down. She chanced a glance up at him. Damien was perfectly still listening. I didn't take it from the register, Clara admitted. I took it from the temporary pile. And then when I was mopping behind the bar, I bumped the digital pour spout on the well whiskey, just enough to uncalibrate the sensor. It registered empty a few shots early. The volume matched the missing cash. It just looked like a busy night with sloppy pours. Silence stretched across the desk. The only sound was the rain lashing against the glass. Damien slowly picked up a thick, leather-bound book from his desk and slid it across the polished oak. It stopped inches from Clara's hands. "Open it," he ordered. She hesitated, then reached out. The pages were thick and filled with dense, hand-written columns of numbers. Dates, amounts, alphanumeric codes. It was a ledger. Not for the club. For something much, much bigger. This is the gross intake for my shipping operations in the South Ward for the last quarter. Damien said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. My chief accountant tells me we are operating at a 9% loss due to overhead and union disputes. I think my chief accountant is buying a summer home in Tuscany with my money. Clara stared at the numbers. They blurred slightly before her eyes. Why are you showing me this? Because you bypassed my security system to feed yourself. You understand the spaces between the numbers, the human element. Damien leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the desk. You are going to find where he is hiding my money. I'm not an accountant, Clara protested, panic flaring in her chest. I don't know anything about shipping, or you have a brain that looks for the cracks in the wall. Damien interrupted his tone, leaving no room for argument. Find the crack. You have 3 days. He went back to his paperwork. The conversation was over. Clara sat there for a long moment, staring at the manila pages. She was a hostage, a pet, a prisoner. But as she pulled the heavy ledger onto her lap, a strange, dark thrill twisted in her gut. He wasn't asking her to scrub blood off his floors. He was handing her the keys to his empire. He was testing her. She picked up a pencil from the desk. The lead was sharp. The numbers didn't lie, but the people who wrote them did. Clara spent the next 72 hours drowning in ink. Damien had given her a small desk in the corner of his study. They worked in silence hours, stretching into the night, accompanied only by the smell of bitter espresso and the scratch of pens. She found the leak on the 3rd night. It wasn't a sophisticated shell corporation. It was a phantom fuel surcharge buried in the manifest of a trucking route that didn't exist, multiplied by 300 deliveries. When she slid the paper across his desk, showing her math, Damien didn't smile. He just stared at the circled number. His jaw ticked. He picked up his phone, dialed a single digit, and said, "Bring him in." Clara didn't ask who. She didn't want to know. The reality of what she had just done settled over her like a lead apron. She had just signed a man's death warrant with a number 2 pencil. "Go to your room, Clara," Damien said softly, not looking up from the paper. She stood up, her knees trembling slightly, and walked out. The house felt suffocating that night. She lay in the massive bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the muffled thuds from the basement. But they never came. Instead, at 3:14 a.m., the world exploded. It wasn't a metaphor. A concussive wave ripped through the air, shaking the heavy oak door of her bedroom on its hinges. The sound was deafening, a deep, chest-rattling boom, followed by the high-pitched shriek of shattering glass from the front of the estate. Clara bolted upright, her heart hammering wildly against her healing ribs. The power died instantly, plunging the room into absolute pitch-black darkness. A second later, emergency red lighting flared in the baseboards, bathing the room in a bloody, pulsing glow. Sirens began to wail. Not police sirens. A localized grinding klaxon that meant the perimeter had been breached. Gunfire. The sharp staccato crack of automatic weapons echoed down the hallway. Panic roar and animalistic seized her throat. She threw off the duvet, her bare feet hitting the floor. She didn't know where to go. Under the bed, the bathroom. The bedroom door was kicked open. Clara screamed, backing up until her spine hit the wall. A massive silhouette filled the doorway, backlit by the red emergency lights. "Move!" It was Damien. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wore dark tactical pants and a black t-shirt. He held a heavy matte black handgun by his side. His breathing was heavy, his face an unreadable mask of absolute focus. He didn't wait for her to comply. He crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed her by the bicep, and hauled her toward the door. His grip was bruising, completely devoid of the gentle precision he had shown before. "Damien, what?" "Shut up and run." He pulled her into the hallway. The air was already thick with the smell of burning drywall and the sharp, sulfuric bite of cordite. Dust rained down from the ceiling. 2 of Damien's guards ran past them, carrying long rifles heading toward the foyer. One of them didn't make it. The massive glass window overlooking the lawn shattered, inward raining shrapnel. A series of suppressed pops echoed from the tree line, and the guard dropped like a stone, a dark pool instantly expanding around his head. Clara choked on a sob, her legs failing. Damien swore violently, a harsh, guttural sound. He wrapped his arm around her waist, practically carrying her, as he broke into a sprint, away from the windows, deeper into the bowels of the house. They reached the end of the corridor, a solid steel door flush with the wall. Damien slammed his palm against a biometric scanner. A heavy mechanical thunk echoed, and he shoved her inside, throwing his weight against the door to seal it shut behind them. The silence in the panic room was absolute. It was a jarring, violent contrast to the chaos outside. The room was small, concrete, and brightly lit by a battery-powered overhead LED. Racks of weapons lined one wall, medical supplies lined the other. The air was stale, smelling of metallic dust and filtered oxygen. Clara collapsed against the concrete wall, sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, hyperventilating. Her lungs couldn't pull in enough air. The image of the guard's head snapping back burned behind her eyelids. "Breathe," Damien ordered. He walked to the center of the room, ejected the magazine from his handgun, checked it, and slammed it back in. His hands were perfectly steady. He was a machine built for this exact environment. They're going to kill us," Clara gasped, digging her fingers into her hair. "They are an amateur crew, hired by a dead accountant," Damien said flatly. He set the gun down on a steel table. "My men will have the lawn cleared in 5 minutes. The police are on our payroll. They will take 20 minutes to arrive. It is already over." He turned his back to her, leaning heavily against the steel table. That was when she saw it. The back of his black t-shirt was torn. A dark, wet slick was spreading rapidly across his right shoulder blade, soaking the fabric and dripping onto the concrete floor. "You're bleeding," Clara whispered, the panic suddenly freezing in her veins, replaced by a cold, sharp shock. Damien glanced over his shoulder, looking at the blood as if it were a minor inconvenience like a spilled coffee. A ricochet off the doorframe. It missed the artery. He reached for the hem of his shirt and pulled it over his head. Clara stopped breathing. His back was a road map of violence. Old scars, thick and white, crisscrossed his skin knife wounds, burn marks, the puckered dimples of old bullet holes. He had not been born a king. He had been carved into one. The fresh wound was a nasty, jagged tear across his shoulder muscle. It was bleeding sluggishly but deeply. He walked to the medical supply shelf, opened a steel tin, and pulled out a bottle of iodine and a staple gun. He set them on the table. He reached over his shoulder with his left hand, trying to angle the iodine bottle over the wound. His jaw clenched in pain, the muscles in his back pulling tightly. He couldn't reach it properly. Clara watched him struggle. The man who owned the city. The man who ordered beatings and executions. He was bleeding out in a concrete box entirely alone. Without thinking, she pushed herself up off the floor. Her bare feet made no sound on the concrete. She stepped up behind him. Damien froze his muscles, instantly tensing, preparing for an attack. "Let me," she said softly. She took the plastic bottle of iodine from his hand. Their fingers brushed. His skin was burning hot. Hers was ice cold. He didn't say a word. He just lowered his arm, submitting to her touch. Clara poured the brown liquid directly into the open wound. Damien hissed his hands, gripping the edge of the steel table so hard the metal groaned, but he didn't pull away. She grabbed a thick gauze pad, pressing it hard against the torn flesh to stop the flow of blood. The intimacy of the moment was suffocating. She was pressing her hands into the back of a murderer, keeping his blood inside his body. She could feel his heartbeat hammering against her palms, fast and heavy. He smelled of sweat gunpowder and that sharp, lingering cologne. "Why did you grab me?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper in the silent room. "I'm just a cleaner, a faulty cog." Damien's chest rose and fell with a heavy breath. He looked down at the steel table. "Because a machine doesn't work if it leaves pieces of itself behind," he said quietly. It was a lie. A cold, pragmatic lie to cover up the fact that when the glass shattered, his first instinct hadn't been to grab his ledgers or his money or his guns. He had run to her room. Clara picked up the medical stapler. She pressed the cold metal against the edge of the wound. "This is going to hurt," she warned him. "Do it." She squeezed the trigger. The heavy metal staple bit into his skin with a wet crunch. He didn't flinch. She squeezed it again and again, pulling the ragged edges of his flesh together, stitching the monster back up. The estate smelled of bleach and ozone. It had been 12 hours since the attack. The bodies were gone. The shattered glass in the foyer had been swept away and replaced by heavy wooden boarding. The silent men in the suits were back, pacing the halls, though there were twice as many now carrying heavier weapons. Clara stood by the boarded-up window in the living room, staring at the thin slivers of grey daylight bleeding through the wood. She was wearing her old clothes, the grey t-shirt with the slit up the middle from Dr. Hayes's shears, and the stiff, cheap jeans. Maria had washed them, but they still felt wrong. They felt like a life she didn't belong to anymore. Footsteps approached, slow, heavy, and slightly uneven. Damien walked into the room. His right arm was in a black sling, immobilizing his stapled shoulder. He wore a dark suit jacket, draped over his uninjured side, looking every bit the untouchable boss again. The vulnerability of the panic room was entirely gone, locked away behind his cold, dark eyes. He stopped a few feet from her. He held a thick, heavy manila envelope in his left hand. He tossed it onto the glass coffee table between them. It landed with a dense, heavy thud. "There is $50,000 in cash in that envelope," Damien said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "As well as a passport with a new name, A driver's license and keys to a sedan parked a mile down the road. The trunk has a change of clothes and a burner phone. Clara stared at the envelope. Her heart gave a painful, erratic thump against her bruised ribs. What is this severance? Damien looked away, staring at the wooden boards covering the window. You found the leak in my ledger. You proved your utility. Your debt was cleared weeks ago. You are a civilian, Clara. The people who attacked my house last night, they don't leave survivors. You are a liability to me, and I am a liability to you. The front door is unlocked. Walk out. He was letting her go. It was what she had prayed for every single night since Ricky had kicked her into the asphalt. Freedom, money, a clean slate. She could take that envelope drive away and never smell cheap whiskey or stale blood again. She could be normal. She took a step toward the table. Her hand hovered over the thick brown paper. She looked back up at him. Damien's jaw was locked tight. He wasn't looking at her. He was waiting for her to vanish, cutting out the one variable in his perfectly controlled world that he couldn't predict. Clara closed her eyes. She remembered the alley, the cold rain, the utter paralyzing helplessness of being nothing. Out there she was prey. Out there men like Ricky could break her bones for $40, and nobody would bat an eye. She opened her eyes and looked around the massive, silent room. The walls of this house were soaked in blood. The man standing in front of her was ruthless, cold, and a killer. But when the bullets started flying, he hadn't used her as a shield. He had carried her to the concrete box. He had let her stitch his skin back together. She didn't want to be prey anymore. And standing in the shadow of the devil, she realized she felt entirely safe. Clara pulled her hand back from the envelope. She stepped around the coffee table, closing the distance between them. Damien finally looked down at her, his dark eyes widening just a fraction of an inch. A massive display of shock for a man who controlled everything. "I don't want a new name," Clara said softly, her voice steady. "Clara." He warned, a low, dangerous rumble in his chest. "If you stay, you are in the machine. There is no getting out. You will see things that will rot your soul. You will be complicit." "I know," she whispered. She reached out her small, pale hand, resting lightly against the black fabric of his sling, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, rhythmic beat beneath her palm. It matched her own. "I like the ink," she said, looking up into his eyes. "I like finding the cracks. You need someone to watch the numbers, Damien. You need someone who knows how the rats operate." Damien stared down at her. The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing against them. He was searching her face, for fear, for hesitation, for the naive girl he had dragged out of the rain. But that girl was gone. She had died in the alley, and the woman standing before him was forged in the cold, sterile air of his estate. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his uninjured left hand. He didn't touch her face. He wrapped his fingers around the back of her neck, his grip firm, possessing, and absolute. "If you stay," Damien murmured, the gravel in his voice scraping against her senses, "you belong to me. Completely." Clara didn't flinch. She leaned into the heavy, warm weight of his hand. "I know," she breathed. Damien pulled her against his chest. The smell of ozone, expensive cologne, and dark power enveloped her. Outside, the rain began to fall again, drumming softly against the wooden boards. But Clara didn't feel the cold. She closed her eyes, entirely safe in the dark.